Welcome everyone to this webinar on social analysis. Very grateful to Matt for his willingness to focus this conversation today, to lead us, if you will, into the pastoral circle. Matt, let me turn it over to you.
Pardon?
Thanks, Don. So maybe if you haven't done so already, if you could
Did you register?
mute yourself. And we are going to, in talking with Don, because of the very nature of the topic, See Judge Act, and looking at social analysis, that it is an interactive bottom-up approach. We will be having two places where we're going to break out into breakout rooms, and you'll get a chance to give this a try in terms of doing that. So you will have the chance to interact with each other. My name is Matt Dulka. I know some of you are new faces on Zoom. I help coordinate Maryknoll's mission education and promotion efforts here in the United States. I've been with Maryknoll for longer than I care to remember how many years it is, but for a long time. And the work that we do in the United States, and I see I have a good number of my colleagues joining me, is to do mission education promotion. And this is the methodology that we've been using. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen. I may not be able to see you, so if you have a question or you want to jump in, go ahead and do that. Now let me see, here we go. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Good, okay, great. So welcome again. The See Judge Act methodology, sometimes called the pastoral circle, has roots that go back and can be traced into the Old Testament in terms of how this approach has been used. But in terms of Catholic environment in our world, it is something that kind of developed in the last 100+ years as this very specific methodology. And the basic question that it was trying to come up to answer or to deal with is, how is we as a Christian community, are we making sense of the world around us? And this became a very important critical issue for the church around the time of the Industrial Revolution. And people were trying to make sense of the rapid changes that were happening in Western Europe at the time. Joseph Cardinal Cardinge worked in Belgium with the Young Christian Workers movement in the 1920s, and he began to use this method. He was a friend of Pope John the 23rd and had his ear and suggested that that should be the methodology that was used in the encyclical Mater et Magistra in 1961. And this is the first time that we see Judge Act being introduced into Catholic social teaching as a methodology. It definitely picks up and gathers great steam in Gaudium et Spes. I think most of us are familiar with the tagline, reading the signs of the times. And this was a huge shift in the way that the church was approaching the question of how do we deal with what's going on in the world, because for the first time, very intentionally and explicitly took a historically conscious approach to understanding what was going on in terms of reading the signs of the times. And I think a lot of us have heard that with a copy of the newspaper in one hand, of course, this would be your iPad, I guess now, and your Bible in the other hand, to look at the situation of the world around us. Since the early 60s, it has been the methodology that's been used in all Catholic social teaching. You'll see it in all the encyclicals as it gets picked up. But of interesting note is that Pope Francis uses this methodology in the Parousia when he was still in South America. But then in his pastoral plan for the church, Evangelii Gaudium, he uses this methodology throughout. And one of the principles in which that he relies on is he says that realities are more important than ideas. We'll talk about that more in a little bit here. But most recently, you would see the methodology clearly being used in Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti. So that I think just gives you a little sense of where this is coming from and why it's important in terms of what we're going to be doing. And for the USCMA conference this year, this will be the methodology that will be used to look at migration, which we're going to talk a little bit more about later. But I just want to make sure you got the framework. You understand this isn't something I'm making up or Don made up, right? This is the methodology that the church has been using, particularly in dealing with Catholic social teaching on it. In understanding the methodology, it's important to understand how the church shifted from a deductive way of thinking around these issues to an inductive way of thinking. I think, we're all familiar with both, although I think most of us who were educated in, the United States or Western Europe have been educated much more on a deductive, where you learn the principles, the conclusions, the rules, and then you learn how to apply it. It's kind of a top-down approach. Inductive reasoning or inductive teaching or thinking is where you do it the other way, where you start with observation, reality, experience, and data, and then from that, you draw what the principles and conclusions are. Within the Catholic world, a lot of the theology coming out of the Middle Ages forward was heavily influenced by deductive thinking. And we see with the change with the Industrial Revolution and the development of Catholic social teaching, there's this shift to inductive reasoning. So out of that, we have what's called sometimes the See, Judge, Act, or the pastoral circle. And sometimes it's been given some other names with it. A couple things to understand: it's a circle. It's supposed to be a guidepost or a map. It's not a recipe that you can follow exactly. It's not like baking. It's more like cooking in that sense. And it can be messy. And even though it lays out a method and a pattern, it really is nonlinear. And it can happen in very quick, rapid processes, or it can happen in longer processes, or it can happen with circles within circles. But really what it ends up being more is a spiral. As you go through it, you keep going deeper and deeper in your experience with God. One thing I want to note though, as we go forward, most people in English struggle with the word judge. And it's because of the connotation in English of judge being very judgmental. As we're going to talk about as we break it down a little bit more, the judge part really has to do more with discerning, praying over, reflecting. So if those words work for you, take out judge and use one of those words instead. Because we don't want to, again, it's a translation. We don't want to get, words matter, but we don't want to get hung up. But for purposes of this, we're going to use the word judge because that's what's used in the literature. Now, coming out of the experience of this, and we're going to break down the circle a little bit before we apply it, is particularly coming out of the experience of how it was used in Latin America, is that two other components were seen as very, very important in this process of when you see, you judge, act, but then you also take time to evaluate. And more importantly, probably, or most importantly, is the notion of celebrating and adding those two components into the process of it. But basically, again, this is using an inductive approach where you start with the reality, you put it through the lens of our faith, primarily for us, the gospel, and then you discern or listen to where God's calling us or the Spirit's moving us to act in doing that. And the reason why this is really important is because our understanding of mission and our understanding of our place is that, as Jesus did, we're called to proclaim the reign of God. And in the Jesus experience, when we look at the Gospels, Jesus refers to this as something that always has been happening since the moment of creation and probably before, that's happening now, that's breaking in as this very moment is occurring, and it's something that's yet to come. And in capturing this notion or trying to get our heads around this idea of this kingdom that is something that was, is, and will be, the See, Judge, Act or pastoral circle helps us fully engage and enter into that and acknowledge the fact that God's still at work. The Spirit is still at work in the world, and that mission is still unfolding. That Pentecost isn't a historic event, but Pentecost is a dynamic that began when Jesus passed the mission on to the Christian community. And it's something that has continued to happen and that we continue to influence for the last 2,000 years, and that the torch has now been passed on to us. in the process of doing this. So just a couple of quick reminders, and I know with this group, these are all quotes that are very familiar with you, but the first one from Justice in the World talks about how important that mission isn't something that's focused on individual conversion solely or singularly, but it is something but mission is involved in transforming the world and working for justice. From Gaudium et Spes, we're reminded too that we are tied in a network of interdependence and global solidarity, and what affects everybody affects us. And we'll see this is really important when we do the circle, that we're not just looking at our own stories, but we're looking at the stories of others as well, that everything's included in that. And then finally, the last quote from Evangelii Gaudium is this invitation or reminder by Pope Francis that we're called to go beyond ourselves, to leave the comfort of the shore. And that mission is about sharing the excitement that we have. So when we talk about See, Judge, Act and its importance in mission, Evangelii Gaudium provides us a good reminder of what we see as a missionary discipleship dynamic in that Pope Francis invites us to go beyond the comfort of our shore, to have an encounter beyond ourselves, and particularly to have that encounter at the periphery or at the margins, the places we wouldn't normally be engaged in. And when we do that, what happens is that there is disturbance that can occur. And the disturbance, oops, let me go back, hit the wrong, got a little excited there. Okay, so with disturbance, we have two responses to it. As we saw in the reading of The Woman in the Well, if you use the RCI readings recently, is that this was an encounter that shouldn't have happened, right, at all. Jesus and Samaritan women shouldn't, but they both enter into an encounter out of their comfort zone at the periphery. There's a disturbance created. The thing is they choose to enter into that disturbance, and out of that, both of them are transformed and both of them experience great joy. But compare that to the story of the rich young man from the gospel, where there is that question of who's my neighbor. He's greatly disturbed by it. Jesus tells him who the neighbor is and what he should be doing about the neighbor. And the rich young man in the disturbance moves out of the circle, right? He refuses to come out of her comfort zone. So this is good to keep in mind in terms of how this dynamic works, that when we do enter into See, Judge, Act, there will be disturbance, but it will also bring about transformation. That transformation will be joy. And that joy really is the engine of mission. As Jesus did 2,000 years ago, and as we're reminded in every generation since then, that it's once you experience that joy, you're almost compelled to share that good news, which then encourages you to make greater efforts at leaving your comfort of the shores, or move out of your comfort zone, and to have even deeper and deeper encounters. Again, this notion of it being more of a spiral in terms of moving forward. So let's take a little bit deeper dive into the components of it. So the C part of it is looking at the reality, right? And it breaks into two parts, one subjective and one is objective. Subjective is looking at the story of our experiences. And that, of course, would be our own story. That's very important to do that. But it's also important to look at the stories of others. But if we stay just there, our view becomes very narrow. It's either just going to be our experience or the experience of others. So the methodology brings in an objective opponent to try and contextualize this. And we call that social analysis. And we're going to focus a little bit more on social analysis today, and why that's so critical and important that we bring in an objective sense of what's going on as we move forward. We'll be in the circle looking at the experience piece of it.
Oh, shit.
So let's take a little bit more at what is social analysis. So it's contextualizing the situation. And what we're going to want to look at when we move beyond just our stories and the stories of others are what are the historical developments, understanding that God's revelation, the kingdom, the reign has been breaking in, is breaking in, and will break in. So where does this fit in the historical piece of it? The structural elements of both formal and informal. Humans have organized ourselves from the beginning in structures and systems. What are those? And how does this particular issue or concern that's coming up fit into that? And then the next one is looking at how things are understood and broken down by within society. our way of organizing ourselves, the way of organizing information, our way of distributing goods and resources, of power are often broken down into economical, political, racial, and religious. Another element is looking at the connections between different levels. So there's almost a mapping or linking that goes on in this process of trying to understand it. So one example of would be, for example, if a homeless person shows up at the, and this is a real example from my own experience, where a homeless person showed up at the church and wanted to camp in the vestibule, right? And so it was brought to the parish to kind of figure out what to do with it, because the parents of the school were very much concerned about safety for their children. And so we, not only listening to our own stories and experiences like that of the parents of being afraid, or of certain parishioners, St. Vincent de Paul, that wanted to help, how did this fit in, in the story of the homeless person? But, what were the causes of homelessness? What's, where's this coming from? Why haven't we seen this come up before? What are the social, political, what are the interconnections between, mental health and substance abuse and so forth? So these are the different elements. One thing to be really important about when we're doing the social analysis and the research, and this is really relying on the social sciences, is to also be careful that we do it critically and we don't have an uncritical use. So this is one of the corrections that Pope Benedict, when he was head of the CDF, in terms of dealing with liberation theology, embraced the concept, but also said, be careful of being critical in terms of what the values that are built into it. So if you, and for in that situation, uncritical use of analysis. But there are biases. One of the things in terms of contextualizing that's important is looking at where are you getting your information from? Where are the sources? Are you getting it just from MSNBC, or are you also looking at what Fox News is saying about a situation? So it's important, what sources you're looking at, and to challenge yourself to not just default to your normal places where you would go to get information when you start Googling something. Of course, now with Google, it's just, we can get unlimited amount of information. So the other thing to be careful about is overload, right? And being able, so that's why identifying the issue and clarifying the issue becomes really important. And then mapping it so you know that, okay, if you're talking about homelessness, you know that mental health is one of the issues involved in it, but what we're focusing on is on homelessness. You don't want to go down the rabbit hole, of all the issues with mental health or with substance abuse, but to hold things in tension creatively on that. So when we do social analysis, you can see all these different interconnections of different things that can be helpful in the social sciences, the hard sciences, that we're going to want to kind of take a look at: social, cultural, religious, race, ethnicity, gender, orientation, psychological, biological factors, environmental factors, economic, political, and so forth. And all these, not all of these come into play on every issue, but most of them will be touched on it, because everything is going to be mediated through different lenses and so forth. So once you've checked into what the reality, the next part of it is to come to the judge piece, which is really discerning and reflecting on where's God at in this? What does God say? What does God think and feel? And our sources for judging, or the lens by which we're going to put a value system. Okay, so as I just said, it was important to understand the values that were at play in terms of social analysis. But as a Christian community, we are a community that has a common developing value structure and system. So what is that? Gospel values. Scripture is the most important for us. We look primarily to gospel, but also the Old Testament and the other books of the New Testament. The other piece that we look to in helping us understand it from a Christian perspective is our tradition. We're part of a community. We don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. We can look back at the stories and figure out how have previous generations of Christians dealt with this in terms of their theological reflections on dealing with a particular issue or concern. And again, Catholic social teaching would be, for most of the political, social, economic issues, the place we'd want to look to most particularly. And then the third source in doing theological reflection is the lived faith. And this is a really important part. This would be the small t tradition. This is how people, through devotional practices or popular religiosity, are every day doing theological reflection and trying to make sense of the world around them. In the experience of small Christian communities, this becomes a critical factor that they're going to bring in very intuitively and very naturally when we do the judge part on it. And then finally, that brings us to act. And in this culture, we tend to act individually. Around the world, it'll be more communal. But as what we see in the examples of the early Christian community, the importance of communal action is that the gifts of the Spirit aren't dumped all on one person. They're distributed around a whole community. And it's only when the community comes together, each bringing that gift, their own particular experience and their talents together, that we have the fullness to be able to respond. And again, in terms of acting, it's important that we evaluate and of course celebrate what we're doing as we go forward. So we're going to jump into the small groups here in a minute, but just to kind of understand how these three pieces work together dynamically, what happens if one of them's missing? So if we have C and we have act, but we take out judge out of the equation, what happens? So this here is the situation where people are observing what's going on and then coming up with a plan and acting on it. But the judge part, it's not going through the lens of the gospel or those other, there's no theological reflection. So what can happen is, this is what happens sometimes with secularism or relativism. And the concern and issue with this is that what's the value system that's being applied here? And on one level, there's always going to be a value system applied. You can't be completely objective. So that's one of the critiques around secularism or relativism, is that it doesn't have that value system. So what happens under scenario number 2 if you have judge and act? So this would be where you're only listening to your own story. You're doing no social analysis in this piece. So you're relying only on your own experience. What happens in this case is you're just solely focused on your own experiences. This is where you end up with fundamentalism, with QAnon, with false news, because there's no listening to the story of others, and there's no objective screen to look at this at all. So that's the danger what happens when you take out the social analysis and the story of others. And what happens if you take out the act part? If you do all the right things in terms of your story, the story of others, social analysis, you do the theological reflection as a community using the Gospels, but you never do anything about it. And this is, of course, what happens, the situation we find with armchair Christians. This is one of the critiques sometimes around Bible study groups, right? The difference between a small Christian community and a Bible study group is the small Christian community is putting it into action. So again, these applications of how it's used, again, in Catholic social teaching, it's a really good method for strategic planning and pastoral management. At Maryknoll, this is what we use. Every year when we do our strategic plan, we see Judge Act in terms of doing it. It's worked really, really well for us. It's a great methodology for teaching and faith formation if you're putting together a workshop or you're called to do a class. It is coming primarily out of experience within Latin America and now Africa. It is the method that's being used by the smaller based Christian communities. And it's also something that can be done and you can incorporate into your own spirituality. Dovetails very well, for example, with Ignatian spirituality. So anyway, that is the quick or not so quick overview in terms of how the method works. When Don and I were talking, what we wanted to do is give you a chance to give it a spin. It's like test driving a car, right? We're not going to be able to do it real in depth, but at least give you an opportunity in small groups to talk about these different pieces and how they work together. So we have a scenario and we have facilitators, and Don's going to break us out now into small groups. Let me put the link to the scenario so everybody has that in the chat. In just a second while Don starts setting up the small groups here.
Yeah, not a problem there, Matt. Take your time to do that. Before we break into small groups and we look at the scenario that Matt has given to us, there's a couple of questions that have emerged in the chat function, so I thought we would just address those first.
Okay, great.
One question that came up is this question about social analysis and what actually makes social analysis objective? The question goes on to say, does it not involve putting the deductive on top of the inductive elements? In other words, an imposition of previously formed opinions on the current narrative. So
That's a great question. So first of all, nothing's totally objective, right? When I was teaching Catholic social teaching to a group of deacons, there was one of the guys in the group was a meteorologist, and we were going through this. He's like, well, "This sounds a lot like the scientific method. I've never seen this applied to theology or Catholic teaching, because I always learned it from more of a you learn the catechism, and then you learn what the rules are, and then you learn how to apply it. So that's why it's critically important in doing social analysis is to be aware of that and be very aware of what sources you're looking to for it. But when you rely on the social sciences, when you're relying on experts in the areas of political science or sociology, economics, and so forth, within their own disciplines, they recognize this too. But they are trying to, the goal anyway is to be as objective as possible. So, that is, so that is a factor. But if you take it out, if you were just to like write it all off as everything is subjective no matter what, you're stuck with a very myopic, narrow viewpoint. So if the goal is to constantly be expanding the horizon of understanding, you're going to bring those things into the discussion and into consideration, but you're going to be, have a critical eye towards why are they doing what they're doing? What is their viewpoint? Who is included in the research? Who is excluded? What were the cultural biases that went into that? What were the religious biases that went into that data and into that analysis that was done by that group?
Right. I think that's really, really well said, Matt, that what makes objective data objective is that there's a commonly agreed upon set of principles that you use that governs the inductive method, and the whole notion of peer review, so that I'm going to ask 16-year-olds what they think about something, and you're going to ask 16-year-olds what they think about something, and our findings should be comparable to one another. And if they're not, then we have to try and explain the disconnect. What caused that? Well, I was talking to 16-year-olds in a very poor neighborhood. You were talking to 16-year-olds in a very rich neighborhood. So, and so it's that kind of peer review in terms of method that becomes really critical in the inductive method. And we all take shortcuts, right? And so we start to say, well, I've looked at this person and the way they frame things, the way they understand things, whether that's analysis is political or economic or sociological, and then we start to trust them because we see them as an expert that has been vetted by other experts.
Good. So what we're going to do in the breakout rooms is we're going to have you do a little role playing. We're going to have you pretend or imagine that you are a parish council, and the scenario is basically that you're all part of a parish in which most of the parish community belongs to the same social, political, economic, and racial community. And in the community, you notice a small outside of the parish, outside in the neighborhood, you notice that there's a small but growing number of immigrants from Togo. And again, if you don't know where Togo is, this is one of the first questions around social analysis. Where is Togo? Where are these people coming from? Anyway, at Mass, Togolese couple, Ahmed and Abla, start attending, and they come to Coffee and Donuts after Mass. And at Coffee and Donuts, they're beginning to share with people the struggles that they're facing in terms of finding jobs, adequate housing, and some discrimination that they're facing in the community. These are all brought to you now as the parish council for consideration. So as a parish council, you decide that you're going to use C-Judge Act to take a look at this issue. So in the first moment that we're going to break you out into breakout groups is we're going to ask you to focus on the C part of it. We're going to ask you to do a little bit of check-in on your own story, your own experience about what how you connect to the migration story. And then have you then jump for social analysis, since you're not going to be able to do social analysis, but what you could do, what we're going to ask you to do in this group is, what are the questions that you'd want to find out? What are the topics you'd want to research? Who are the experts that you'd want to talk to? What are the resources you'd want to go to try and find out, to do social analysis? So we're going to do that for about 20 minutes, and then we'll invite you to come back and report back on how that went.
Great. All right, so give me a minute while I create these rooms. I'm going to put everybody in a room, but then I have to switch around so the facilitators can be there. So I'm going to go ahead and create the rooms. There'll be about 5 to 6 people in all those rooms, and then I will shift people accordingly.
So that leads us into seeing, we need to see them as they are, you know, by observing who they sit with, who maybe Togans sit only Togans, and whatever the other community background is. Maybe we can learn something from that observation and ask ourselves how we engage with that. The value central to this is very rooted in the Catholic, and certainly after seeing the social, economic, and learning from the language and all, where Togo is at and all that, we can start by treating people with concern and respect. Very basic, but very humane. And last, I will say, if for the other members of the team, I want to say something else. To be careful not to, you know, when we listen in the assumptions we take, you know, maybe before we jump into start listening to them, we already come with the baggage of assumptions. Maybe the conversion had to start from our listening to ourselves to, you know, who is a Togan for me? Why it brings this idea of, you know, African, all these kind of things that we carry, we're humans. And quite honestly, sometimes we carry for a long time. So I think it starts with this conversion before we engage to this assumption and just jump. So yeah. I don't know if the others members will say something.
Well, we're just because we have a lot to cover. Just a couple of things, Fernando. I really appreciate what you were saying in terms of being in touch with your own bias and your own way that you look at things. And that's why sharing your own story about immigration and how you view it's really, really important, you know, in terms of that baggage that you bring in and effective listening. So we're just, obviously we're having to just skim across the top of this. Why don't we go to room 2, and anything that you would add to that, in your group that you identified as important in terms of the C piece of this, in terms of either the stories or the social analysis.
Absolutely. Our group was very diversified from various backgrounds and have lived throughout the world. And again, we didn't want to be blindsided. So bringing the couple in very specifically to talk about the issues that they're experiencing, hearing their history, hearing the problems that they're experiencing. What do they have a language issue? Are there health care issues? And then ultimately hearing their story and inviting the entire community to the parish to hear everyone tell their story, meet the people, and understand the problems and learn some of the history and issues why they have left Togo to come to the US.
Okay, thanks. So what I'm hearing, one of the new ideas I heard from you, the building on this, is, you know, making sure that the whole parish can hear their stories and share their own stories around migration. Everybody has a migration story. Really good. Thank you. What about room 3? I think, Brenda, you were in that room.
I think it was, well, I don't know if I'm 3 or 4, but yes, I'm gonna report back. So we didn't get to discuss exactly the social analysis, but something that that we notice is that the council members have very personal experiences of immigration and understand the phenomenon of immigration. The council members appreciate diverse cultural practices and faith devotions. However, our blind spot is that we might forget our brothers and sisters coming from Togo, and also we might forget that their experience of immigration is different than ours. Another blind spot will be not being able to communicate with them due to language barriers and wanting them to communicate the way we do. So some of the questions we came up with for Ahmed and Abla was about asking them how do they access resources in where they come from? How are they used to access resources? What are the struggles they are currently facing? And asking them how we as a council or a parish community can support them. But another thing we talked about was the importance of understanding the cultural and social context of the place they come from and how it is to walk a day in their shoes in Togo.
Yeah, those are really, really good points. I have to, when Don gave me Togo as our scenario country, I knew it was somewhere in West Africa, but I had to go Google it to find it, even to know where it was. So yeah, those are really good points. And I like how the idea of walking in the, what it would be like walking in the shoes, but also looking at, what are the realities that brought them here. Thank you. Room 4, let's see, I think Luna, you were in that room.
Yeah. So we had a really diverse group of people in our small group. We even had someone who is from Tanzania and calling from Tanzania. So we got pretty lucky where he shared his experience when he came to the United States. So we actually didn't get too much into the questions that we would ask because we were focused on some of the language that was used for these questions for us. So instead of using the word, like we have to be mindful of the word migrant, because if we're looking or talking to Native Americans, we're the ones that are migrants. So there's that. And then interviewing, to interview someone, it has like a position of power, or it has a connotation of there's a position in power. So we talked about how maybe having a couple come in might be intimidating to share their story to a large group of people. So instead having, inviting them over for a dinner or something, inviting them into our home, and having them retell their story or tell us their story will really allow us to listen and to hear what the needs are. So that's as far as we've gotten.
Yeah, so it's in terms of on the C part of hearing their stories, how people share and tell stories varies by culture, right? And so, doing some social analysis and research in terms of, what is their tradition for being able to share is over maybe in that culture that only makes sense to do it over a meal, as compared to getting them on a microphone in front of a large group at the parish hall, or at the AMBO, right? So yeah, very good points. Thank you, Luna. Let's see, room 5, Kevin, I think you were in that room, Kevin McCarthy.
Yes, we were ably led by Father Leo Shea. We talked after the immigration piece mainly about our own biases or blind spots, and said, that those of us who are white and had white ancestors, they assimilated more easily. And that was part of our bias, thinking that others could do the same perhaps. And then having different responses to immigration policy, depending who was in power. Some would say Obama's policies were harsh, but we didn't advocate as much against them, as opposed to when Trump came in power, and they were maybe even harsher, but we felt more of a move. So there's some particular biases there. And I think some of the other things we talked about were similar to the other groups.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. You point to something that's really important in social analysis, and that's kind of understanding, the different contexts, right? We were talking about structures and then also levels and layers of it. The experience of if your grandparents came from Western Europe, navigating immigration was dramatically different than for somebody who's navigating it. And then also it makes a big difference on the color of your skin. If you show up at the border in El Paso Juarez and you're African versus you're Central American, you know, what's you know, the analysis in terms of why people are treated differently in those particular situations. But then also, again, the question of bias too, within the parish council. Are you going to react differently to migrants that are coming from Togo as you would that are coming from Mexico in your community? You know, in terms of what does that evoke, and you know what your response are and why. But the social analysis is taking the stories and then asking the why questions. Why is it different? And what's going on with that? Room 6, let's see, we had Jorge. I think you were in that room.
Yes, Father Mark is going to share a few words of what we discussed. Your mic, Father. Your microphone. Okay.
Mark, you might be muted. You have to click the mute button in the far lower left-hand corner.
Mute, okay. All right. Several of us had some experience with Hispanic communities and thought, I believe we could at least use that as some experience of someone coming from another country. But we felt the big thing was to treat people fairly, welcome them, really have a warm welcome as much as we could, and try to know more about their family, not just whether they were by themselves or whether with other people they could relate to, and get some idea of why they have come, and maybe what services they need, so that, you know, we're not simply asking them for their experience, but also trying to interact with them that would be helpful for them. Anyway, again, trying to see what their needs are, and whether it's educational opportunities or jobs or something like that, so that we're trying to be as welcoming as we possibly can.
Good, thank you. Room 7, did that room happen? I think we had 2 people, so that would have maybe been a pairing more than a,
Sister Carol Jean will speak. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Like other groups, we didn't follow the questions exactly, but we also addressed the concept of bias and what does that mean? And what are our biases, and how do we sometimes make judgments because someone is doing something differently than we are doing them? Or we see someone standing in a grocery store looking very perplexed and we think, oh, they're not very intelligent. And it has nothing to do with intelligence at all. But to recognize that that can be a bias that we do have. We did talk about the Haitian proverb, which says we see from where we stand. And recognizing that we all stand in different places, and we can't expect someone to know what we know necessarily, because they haven't been standing in our shoes, but also we haven't been standing in theirs. And so we said one of the things we'd like to do is ask them to share their experiences. Tell us about yourselves. You know, before we tell you all about us, you tell us about you, and we can share that. And look very carefully at our own biases. And someone flipped the idea of inviting them to our home to maybe we could go to their homes, because we may learn a great deal more about them if we did that than if we invited them to ours. We talked about, you know, how confusing it is sometimes for people when they come from another country. Several of us have worked in Africa, so we're a little familiar with the culture, but recognizing that choice in our society is almost overwhelming sometimes. And so we shared a few examples of that. I was sharing having a Kenyan friend here, and I took her to Subway for lunch and was just overwhelmed by her response to that, and realizing, you know, everything. What kind of bread do you want? What kind of cheese do you want? What kind of vegetables do you want? What kind of meat do you want? You know, and she just said, I just want a sandwich. you know, but we don't think about those things because it's something that happens just regularly for us. Is there anybody else in our group who can think of other things that we contributed?
We did spend some time talking about cultures, and because we had worked in different parts of Africa, there's 54 countries in Africa. There's thousands of languages and there's actually thousands of cultures. So we cannot jump from a South African experience to a Togolese experience or whatever. So there's always that risk of having made assumptions that just don't fit.
Yeah, and I think, John, you point to a really good point, and you too, Carol Jean, about, you know, talking with other people who may have had similar experiences, people who have been to Africa, you know, so it's not just about listening to their story. And I loved your idea about inviting yourself to their house for dinner. I mean, we know Jesus did that with Zacchaeus, right? So we have a good model of that in terms of encounter. But, you know, thinking about those other experts that you can, you know, that you can round out your own sense and check your own biases at the same time. In terms of, if you've lived in Africa, you know that, you know, they're going to approach, you know, they're going to see things through the lens of community more than as an individual here in the United States, right? You know, there's going to be things around hospitality and stuff that are going to be, you know, even around that are going to be important.
We also recognize that there's 54 countries in Africa.
Right.
And that they are also very different oftentimes.
Right, and as you know, within Kenya, how many different ethnic communities within Kenya, Tanzania, exactly. So I want to make sure everyone's got a chance to report back. Room 9 was, I see just Yvonne listed in there.
That's right. So yeah.
You were alone?
No report, no report. No, I moved, there were just 2 of us, and so we moved the others into another room that already had a facilitator.
Okay, great. How about, oh yeah, in room 10, that was my room. So Anne's going to report back.
Yeah, room 8, you missed.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's
Yeah,
all right.
Room 8. Who's room 8? Yeah, Joan, that was you?
Yeah, well, I'll be glad to report for our group.
Okay.
We had a lively discussion, much of what's already been said, but a couple of things that weren't said that maybe we could add to this is how important it would be to know why they came to this country. In other words, what's the situation of in Togo that may have made them leave? And then what do we know about the immigration process in this country, and what is their legal status? And the possibilities and constraints around social services, the laws, et cetera. So as a parish council, if we don't know that, we can't help them.
Excellent, really, and you're really honing in on the social analysis piece of it in terms of, you know, what's the legal context in terms of their status, and then, you know, do they have work permits? Can they even work? You know, so finding them a job, you know, or as a parish, do we have to figure out a way to, you know, support them, you know, employ them in a way before they can officially get work permits? And then what are the social services that are available, you know, are there any? And if they're not, what is, you know, because that may prompt us as a parish community, is that we may be going down to the county board of supervisors, right? And saying, you know, these people are coming into our community and there's, you know, they can't get general assistance. They're excluded from it. You know, we need to do something differently. So those are really, thank you. Good points. So let's go to room 10 and then we'll kind of try and see if we can pull this all together because I know we're running out of time. So, Anne.
Yeah, well, the benefit of going last is to just say really dittos. Largely everyone covered the main points of our group, but maybe I would add that we did mention that it's so important to be explicit with these new folks that we are enriched by knowing them, and that it's not just a service endeavor. It's bi-directional, and we hunger for their story, and that our story will be forever impacted by their story. So somehow to make sure that's in and through all of the perhaps more you know, operationalizing pragmatic things that you do to get started, get to know them.
Thanks, Anne. That's such a great segue in terms of pulling this all together. the scenario would have taken you, if we had time, to break out and to do part of the do the judge piece and the act piece of this. But we can give you the scenario if you want to play with it on your own or use it on your own. But your point, Anne, is so important because a new group shows up at the parish, at Mass, that doesn't look like us and is raising some concerns, does create a disturbance. And as a parish community, and we talk about Pope Francis and missionary discipleship is envisioned by Evangelii Gaudium, is when you enter into disturbance, you have the choice. Either you lean into it or you run from it, right? And, more than often, a lot of people run from it, right? But if you lean into it, both sides are going to end, them as well as the community are going to be transformed by the experience. And if that transformation happens, both are going to experience joy, which is going to make the community much more vibrant and more able to reach out in other places and have those encounters in different ways and to be connected. But if you don't, you deny yourself the opportunity of that transformation. Just as we kind of wrap up here, and then I want to open up if there's any questions or comments on the process. So this was taking us at the very early stages of the C Judge Act, of looking at under the C part, getting in touch with our own stories so that we can check our biases and understand what we're bringing, positive and sometimes negative, to the situation in terms of our own experiences. The importance of listening to their stories, right? Which are going to be their stories, their particular unique stories. But then to kind of look at how do we contextualize this in the bigger context of immigration policy, issues of how racism's dealt with in the community. Are they, what's it like, for them? A lot of times Africans, they're befuddled by the whole notion of racism in the United States, that, African Americans who've been here they're descendants of slaves face and so forth, and how do you navigate that? But all those different kinds of pieces around, putting it in that broader context to try and understand how, and then the next step would have then been to bring it to prayer and reflection under the judge part. So as a parish community, what would we have done next? What would we have done as a parish council, or would we have engaged the whole parish in a process of theological reflection to ask the question of, where is God in this? Where is the Spirit alive? What is the Spirit prompting us to do? And what are the resources? In my group, one of the resources that was pointed out is the USCCB has web pages on welcoming the migrant. And there's tools there for not only the intercultural exchange piece of it, but also on the theological reflection piece of it. What are the gospel stories? How are we going to engage theologically in this? Are we going to, take and look at, the readings for Sunday? Are we going to engage in, what Catholic social teaching, gives us a sense of it? And then as a community, we bring that all to prayer and discernment, and asking that question is, what is the Spirit asking us or inviting us to do, I should say, to do in terms of this particular situation? And from that, then begin to look at what would be a pastoral plan or a pastoral response would be. Someone had mentioned how important it is that the pastor be involved, that things don't happen without that. But what would be the key components or things that you'd want to bring into pastoral planning? Who should be at the table when the decisions are being made? What resources are there that can be brought into, what the options are even for us to get engaged in this? And then, of course, bringing in that notion of evaluate to see how, to step back and see, what is this doing to us? How have we do that? What is the transformation that's going on? What's the disturbance been like? How were we in touch with our biases or not, or aware of our own blind spots? And then as we begin to act, to make sure that, we're not only evaluating whether the plans have been effective and the process has been effective, but then to celebrate too. Has the, where is the joy? Name the joy, celebrate the joy that this has brought, and let that joy then carry us into doing the circle again. Whether it's with more folks from Togo who might arrive, or whether it's like this opened our eyes that there's a whole bunch of people out there in the community and in our parish, if we step outside the parish boundaries, if we really see ourselves as a field hospital, as Pope Francis says, and not as a country club, that's going to get a lot more messy and a lot more complicated as we begin to realize that there's some people that we should be inviting in that we haven't been invited in. And anyway, so that kind of brings us back to the top of the circle again. So we got a couple minutes for comments, questions. If you want to use the chat feature, please do that. We can make all these resources available, our PowerPoint and the scenario available for folks. Yeah. Okay, this process is very good for debriefing after mission trips. Exactly. I mean, isn't a mission immersion trip a C-Judge Act in practice, right? I mean, every day on an immersion trip is a C-Judge Act. And, because one of the questions we do in theological reflection on immersion trips is, where did you encounter God today? And then at the end of our immersion trips, and one of the best practices in immersion trips is before people go home and get caught up in everything else is, what is God inviting you to do about this? That's always a good thing to do at the end of an immersion trip. So yeah, this is a very good process. Thank you, John. Other comments or questions? Jump in if you want or type them in.
I think I'm just gonna add something that was mentioned in our group about the importance of having assemblies for new members and making it also part of the parish life after having the one-on-ones with them, instead of bringing them right away, like you said, Matt, right in front of everyone with a microphone. Having a one-on-one relationship and then having a new members gathering. And I will say, I'm actually going to invite Patty to add to that, because she's the one who talked about it. And I don't think I'm being that well summarizing her great ideas. I don't know if Patty is there, or she left already.
Yeah, no,
There.
I'm here. I was just to add to what Brenda was saying. I was talking about the Alcoholics Anonymous program having a beginners meeting, and how when you have a beginners meeting, you have the ability to have these people that are brand new to the group learn a little bit more about the whole structure of the AA meeting, and how that idea would be so helpful in parishes to have this welcoming committee. I know some parishes do, but I don't see it a lot. And I think it would be really good. It's the rite of Christian initiation is a similar idea of bringing them in through the sacraments. But when you have people moving into the community, where are our welcoming groups, or maybe some mentor groups or partner groups that could be walking with these people? Is that it, Brenda? Is that what you were looking for? Okay.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question about, is there any place for seeking to understand the new person's prejudice or bias toward the culture they are entering, whether that be negative or positive? Yeah, I think that's a really important question in terms of helping them navigate from, so we were talking about doing C-Judge Act from our perspective as the parish council, right? How do you help them do C-Judge Act from their perspective of coming in, and how do we help them network and connect with other people who are having different experience? We were sharing in my group when the Lost Boys were brought to this country, they were, 2 dropped here, 2 dropped there, whatever, all over the place. And one of the important things that were done were networking them so that they could stay in touch with each other and share how they were going through this process of C-Judge Act from their own perspective. But yeah, I mean, so we all have, it can be positive or negative. We all have a lens by which we understand stuff. And the more we understand what that lens is, we can see how it can have positive and negative impacts. But the importance is, not to be too judgmental, in terms of what the bias or preconceived ideas are, but to be able to name them and understand them. It is just part of human life.
Yeah, I just to jump into that too. And one of the things that I want to be very kind of cautious about is kind of the what I would call the notion of purity. And what I mean by that is whenever we're in relationship, things are going to get messy, and that's okay. I mean, part of it is just, again, that's part of the crossing the border, that I'm going to misunderstand, they're going to misunderstand. someone's going to have their toes stepped on. But that's part of the risk, and that's part of the learning. And I think that's really important. So, I mean, I do think, being mindful of those kind of questions, so what are you expecting, and I can easily see that some people could expect a lot from this culture that really we can't deliver. There could be some naivety about what life is like here in the United States.
Can I just say, I would say we have to realize, the council has to realize the onus is on them, not on the immigrants that are coming. History will find them, will judge them. And we can see that even here in the States, the people that were radically mean in the 50s are very, very embarrassed by the videos that are still there today. So the onus is on the parish, and that's where the judgment will lie.
Thank you, Stephen.
I think people from the Togo coming to US, that will be the first time seeing people, of other culture. But for us, we are living with the mixed culture here. And it's different from the, people from Togo seeing us and we seeing them. And it'll be first time experience for them. It'll be very painful experience for them. And for us, we went through these experiences and we know how to deal with this, the painful experience. But for them, you have to be careful how we deal, how we bring in then to our community. Right. Because they won't know our languages and they have to learn. And the culture, we have many cultures here, but they are one culture.
Right.
Thanks, Alfonso. Yeah, navigating culture. Even one's own culture is not easy, and it's very messy, as Don would say. I think we're at our time, huh, Don?
I was just going to say, I think we're at our time. I just think that it's been a very rich conversation. And again, on one hand, and Matt, kind of correct me if I'm wrong here, but the C-Judge Act process, it's a very powerful process. It's also a simple process, but it does take kind of time and practice, and it can become one of our tools in the mission work. As we were having our conversation, one of the hopes that we have is, when I say we, I mean USCMA, is that we really want to see the experience of the migrants as an invitation to mission. And we really want to see mission as an invitation to migrants. And so that's part of what our hope is. Our hope is to have a open conversation about mission and about migration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was, we were in a conversation earlier in this week, and someone was sharing with us, their migration experience, and they were talking about their parents, and they're like, my mom's crossing the border she was a missionary disciple. That's a mission story. And it's such an important point that we recognize that migration is a human phenomenon that goes back to the earliest parts of human history. And it is so linked to our understanding of what mission is. Mission and migration are linked in such a close way, and they inform each other in terms of where God is and God's presence in the world. So Donna, you kind of disappeared. So are we? There you are.
Someone came to the door and I had to answer the door. So okay. I apologize for that. But I think it's time for us to close. I was wondering if someone would feel comfortable leading us in a closing prayer. Anyone feel so moved this afternoon? Okay, well, I will do that. I've been using this prayer that Pope Francis wrote. It's I think it's a wonderful Lenten prayer. I also think it's kind of a confiteor. It's very early in Joy of the Gospel. And it goes like this. Lord, I have let myself be deceived. In 1,000 ways, I have shunned your love. Yet here I am once more to renew my covenant with you. I need you. Save me once again, Lord. Take me once more into your redeeming embrace. Let us go and encounter our brothers and sisters and those who are new to us and welcome them as we would welcome the Lord. Amen.
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 All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Once again, we will follow up with the recording of this and the slides from Matt. And thanks. If you want to hang out and chat for a little bit afterwards, feel free to do that.